The most damning indictment of American industrial policy isn't coming from foreign competitors or economic analysts. It's coming from American manufacturers who discovered that building products in Canada had become easier, more predictable, and more profitable than building them in the country that invented modern mass production. I've been studying American industrial competitiveness for decades, and I can tell you that what we're witnessing represents something unprecedented in the history of global manufacturing, not just because companies are relocating production internationally, which has always happened for cost reasons, but because they're abandoning American manufacturing capacity to escape American regulatory chaos. When the birthplace of mass production becomes too dysfunctional for mass production, we've crossed a threshold that may be impossible to reverse. The public story, as it's been covered in business media, focuses on routine corporate restructuring and strategic optimization. Companies announce facility consolidations, operational efficiency improvements, and market positioning adjustments. Standard corporate language that usually masks the uncomfortable reality that American manufacturing has become uncompetitive, not because of foreign advantages, but because of domestic dysfunction. But what's actually happening in boardrooms across American manufacturing is far more consequential than any euphemistic press release suggests. Senior executives are making calculations that would have been unthinkable just a few years ago, that building products in Canada has become more reliable, more predictable, and ultimately more profitable than building them in the United States. When those calculations consistently favor foreign operations over domestic ones, the industrial exodus becomes inevitable. To understand how devastating this transformation has been for American industrial capacity, you have to understand what made American manufacturing dominant in the first place. It wasn't just natural resources or technological innovation, though both played important roles. It was institutional predictability. Companies could make multi-decade investments in manufacturing infrastructure with confidence that regulatory frameworks, trade policies, and business conditions would remain stable enough to justify massive capital commitments. That institutional predictability has evaporated. When environmental regulations can change overnight based on political calculations, when trade policies shift without warning via social media announcements, when tax incentives appear and disappear based on electoral cycles, manufacturing planning becomes impossible. Companies that need to make billion-dollar facility investments with 20-year payback periods can't operate in an environment where the rules change faster than production schedules. The automotive sector provides perhaps the clearest example of how this regulatory chaos translated into manufacturing exodus. Car production requires enormous upfront investments in specialized facilities, equipment, and workforce training. When companies can't predict whether environmental standards, trade relationships, or labor regulations will remain consistent for the time required to recoup those investments, they relocate to jurisdictions where long-term planning is still possible. Canada offered something that American political culture could no longer provide: boring regulatory stability. Canadian environmental policy doesn't reverse direction every election cycle. Canadian trade relationships don't change based on social media outbursts. Canadian labor regulations operate through established legislative processes rather than arbitrary administrative decisions. For manufacturers that need to plan decades in advance, boring became beautiful. The electronics manufacturing sector followed similar patterns, but with even more dramatic implications for American technological leadership. Electronics production requires not just regulatory stability, but also predictable access to global supply chains, international talent, and research partnerships. When American policies began treating international cooperation as a zero-sum competition rather than a mutual benefit arrangement, electronics manufacturers faced impossible choices. Canadian operations offered access to the same global networks that American facilities had traditionally provided, but without the political volatility that made long-term partnerships unreliable. International suppliers could commit to Canadian facilities with confidence that policy changes wouldn't suddenly make those partnerships illegal or economically unviable. For an industry that depends on stable international relationships, political stability became the determining factor. What makes this manufacturing exodus particularly tragic is how it affects the very communities that political rhetoric claims to protect. When factories relocate to escape American regulatory chaos, American workers don't get the option to relocate with them. They get layoffs, plant closures, and the slow dissolution of the industrial communities that their families had built their lives around. The workers, who were promised that political disruption would bring their jobs back, instead watched political disruption drive their jobs away. The human dimension of this story is particularly heartbreaking because it affects people who had invested their entire careers in American manufacturing. Skilled machinists, industrial engineers, production supervisors, and plant managers who had spent decades building expertise in American facilities discovered that their knowledge and experience were most valuable in Canadian operations that offered the institutional stability American facilities could no longer provide. Some of these workers were able to relocate to Canadian operations, but most weren't. International relocation requires resources and flexibility that most manufacturing workers don't have. They remain in American communities that lose their economic foundations when the factories that anchored local economies relocate to escape American policy dysfunction. The ripple effects spread through every business and service that had depended on manufacturing employment. Canadian officials understood the opportunity this American dysfunction created and positioned themselves accordingly. Instead of trying to compete with American manufacturing through subsidies or incentives, they offered what American politics could no longer deliver: predictable regulatory frameworks that allowed manufacturers to plan investments with confidence that the rules governing their operations would remain recognizable across electoral cycles. This approach proved more attractive than any tax incentive or subsidy program because it addressed the fundamental problem that was driving manufacturing exodus from America: uncertainty. When companies can't predict what their regulatory compliance costs will be next year, when they can't plan supply chains around stable trade relationships, when they can't invest in workforce development without knowing whether immigration policies will remain consistent, they relocate to environments where such planning becomes possible. The broader economic implications of this manufacturing exodus extend far beyond individual companies or communities into questions about American competitiveness in the global economy. Manufacturing isn't just about producing goods. It's about maintaining the industrial capacity that drives innovation, supports supply chains, and anchors economic ecosystems. When that capacity relocates to escape domestic dysfunction, it takes with it the foundation for technological leadership and economic independence. From a strategic perspective, this represents a self-inflicted wound that will take decades to heal, even if American policy eventually stabilizes. Manufacturing infrastructure isn't just physical plants and equipment. It's skilled workforces, supplier networks, institutional knowledge, and innovation ecosystems. Once these components relocate to other countries, rebuilding them requires not just capital investment, but time and trust that may be difficult to restore. What's particularly striking about this crisis is how it reveals the gap between political rhetoric about American manufacturing and the reality of what manufacturers actually need to succeed. Political leaders talk about bringing manufacturing back to America while simultaneously creating the policy instability that drives manufacturing away from America. The contradiction would be comical if the consequences weren't so serious for workers and communities. Canadian manufacturing has experienced unprecedented growth during this period, not because Canadian companies suddenly became more innovative or efficient, but because they could offer manufacturers what American politics could not: the ability to focus on production rather than political risk management. When regulatory compliance becomes predictable, when trade relationships remain stable, when workforce planning isn't subject to sudden policy reversals, manufacturers can devote their resources to manufacturing rather than lobbying. The international dimension of this manufacturing exodus has profound implications for global supply chains and economic relationships. When American manufacturing capacity contracts due to political dysfunction rather than competitive disadvantage, it signals to international partners that the United States may no longer be a reliable foundation for long-term economic planning. Countries and companies begin designing systems that work without American participation rather than with it. This shift is already visible in how major corporations structure their global operations. Instead of treating American facilities as headquarters operations that coordinate international networks, they're treating American operations as regional facilities within networks coordinated from more stable jurisdictions. When the hub becomes less reliable than the spokes, the network reorganizes itself around a new center of gravity. The technological implications are equally concerning for American innovation leadership. Advanced manufacturing increasingly requires integration between research, development, and production capabilities. When production capacity relocates to escape American policy instability, it often takes associated research and development operations with it because proximity between innovation and manufacturing provides competitive advantages that distance cannot replicate. This means that the manufacturing exodus isn't just about losing production jobs. It's about losing the innovation capacity that creates the next generation of manufacturing technologies and processes. When research and development follows manufacturing to more stable policy environments, American technological leadership erodes in ways that affect every sector of the economy, not just the industries that relocate directly. The most sobering aspect of this entire crisis is how completely avoidable it was. The institutional frameworks for maintaining manufacturing competitiveness weren't exotic or impossible to preserve. They just required the kind of political discipline that prioritizes long-term economic health over short-term political advantage. Other developed countries maintained manufacturing capacity by maintaining policy stability. America chose chaos and got the predictable result. For observers trying to understand how economic leadership shifts in the global economy, the American manufacturing exodus offers important lessons about the relationship between political stability and industrial competitiveness. Manufacturing requires massive long-term investments that can only be justified in stable institutional environments. When institutions become unreliable, manufacturing becomes unsustainable, regardless of other competitive advantages. As this exodus continues, what becomes clear is that restoring American manufacturing competitiveness will require not just policy changes, but institutional restoration that may take decades to achieve. Manufacturing capacity can relocate quickly when conditions become unfavorable, but rebuilding that capacity requires time, trust, and consistency that must be demonstrated over extended periods. The manufacturing revolution that made America dominant didn't happen overnight, and neither will any restoration of that dominance. The great manufacturing exodus represents more than an economic setback. It represents a verdict on American governance rendered by the market itself. When American manufacturers conclude that America is no longer the best place to manufacture products, it's not just an indictment of specific policies. It's a judgment on the entire approach to governance that treats institutions as disposable rather than foundational. And once that judgment is rendered by the industry that built American prosperity, reversing it becomes exponentially more difficult than preventing it would have been.